Hey y'all, we're going to do Imperialism today. This is the first lecture of Unit 7. All right, so we started looking at this before, but I think it's important to remember for, context. Whenever we're doing foreign policy, you can always go back to Washington's farewell address, back to when Europe was tearing itself apart during the Napoleonic Wars. Washington famously said that we should avoid entangling alliances. And essentially, our theory has been to leave Europe alone and just focus on ourselves. Now, that was modified with the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine really said was that we will leave Europe alone as long as they leave our hemisphere alone. So you can kind of see by 1822, Europe is starting to colonize, the rest of the world. And the United States sort of sees this, and they do not want our hemisphere to become a part of this contest. Like, we don't want to have, these nations, right, taken over by Europe and then competing with the United States. And so the Monroe Doctrine really just says, we are going to leave you alone if you leave us alone. So we will stay out of European affairs. We will not take sides as long as you do not come into North or South America. So, back when it was made in the Monroe Doctrine, we didn't really have a lot of muscle to enforce it. And we were focusing more on our expansionism, trying to, move west. So while we had the Monroe Doctrine at that time, we were focused more on expansionism. And so expansionism is really what we've looked at in the past. We are, forever moving west, right, in this direction. So, as we are moving west, right, we started back, with this line, the Proclamation line. And then after the Revolution, we go all the way to the Mississippi. During Jefferson, we get the Louisiana Purchase. We're going to annex Texas, but then we have to basically go to the the Mexican-American War to get this. We're going to take this from Great Britain. And so before the Civil War, we have manifested our destiny. We control the land from sea to shining sea. But the next part is going to be, right, now that we have the land, during the Civil War, the other thing that we are going to be doing is connecting with the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to create this interconnected economy. The other part, the important part about, going from sea to shining sea is having a port with which we can export goods out. The Transcontinental Railroad is creating these giant corporations, steel, oil, and all in this interconnected market and interconnected economy. But the other part about it is now we can get our goods out and then we can ship it out to Asia. So these are all things that are important to remember as we are moving along. But expansionism is different than, imperialism, because expansionism, we are treating all of these places as equal states. So Texas, when Texas becomes a part of the Union, right, Texas becomes a state. It has senators, it is in the Congress, it has House representatives, it is, voting on the president. We are not treating Texas, we are not subjugating Texas as a land. Now, do we mistreat people who are in Texas? Yes, that is true. But kind of geographically, we are treating these states the same as we expand out. And what's going to be different is when we do imperialism, we are no longer treating these lands as equal. We are subjugating them. And so this subjugation, this is really the element of what's going to happen as we move out into imperialism. So one of the reasons why some folks believe that we are pushing out beyond and kind of going against our democratic principles. I mean, we started our country as an anti-imperialist country fighting, England, a colonizing force. And, what we believe, that's what our fundamental values. So why are we going to engage in imperialism? Well, Frederick Jackson Turner looked at expansionism, and he believed that there was this frontier spirit in Americans and that we always have to kind of be pushing forward, and that this is a part of what makes us American, what makes us exceptional. And since we had closed the frontier, we had no new frontiers, some people kind of feel like we need to keep pushing out, we need to keep pushing west, we need to keep like moving our borders. Otherwise, if we stay still, we will stagnate. But Frederick Jackson Turner kind of thought that maybe this is going to be a turning point for American identity. What are we going to do now that we don't have a frontier? And some people believe that's part of why we went into imperialism as we kept moving west. So we are going to engage imperialism during this time. We are going to have partial control over like Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. We're going to have Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. This is all going to be happening. We're going to get other things as well. We're going to start our incursions into, North and South America. So this is what we're going to be looking at. Why do we do it? Why are we going against our democratic, anti-imperialist principles? Some people say it's economic. We are looking for control of markets. Other parts are strategic. We want to have routes and refueling stations. Some folks say it's like social, cultural, or ethnocentrism. This would be like that white man's burden. We believe we are better than others and that we should and could take them over. It's kind of like a continuation of that manifest destiny. Politically, it is popular, I guess, and, as extreme nationalism, we want to do it for our country's pride. So the white man's burden is this idea that, it is up to countries like the United States and Great Britain to carry the rest of the world. It is the burden to civilize the rest of the world. Fundamental in this is like scientific racism and the beliefs that other parts of the world cannot take care of themselves. This white man's burden does have a double-edged sword. Some people use this kind of type of racism to say we should take over other countries, and other people are going to use this racism to say we shouldn't take over the countries, which we're going to see later. We are going to turn outward, one, because of the theories, and this is more about the strategic part of it, is Alfred T. Mahan is going to write a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And what he essentially says in this thesis is that if you want to be a major world power, you need to have a strong navy. The U.S. is going to engage in growing its navy because of this thesis, and you're going to see that a lot of what we do actually follows his ideas. The other thing is the yellow press is also going to be involved on it. So other countries are starting to control parts of the world. And one area where European powers have a lot of control is in China. And this is going to affect the United States because we want to trade with China. We want to sell them our stuff. We want to market, which means we want to go to China to sell our stuff. So we can't really sell our stuff when we are blocked out of China, right? Like, let's see, the British are the green. They are controlling this region, right? So we can't really get in there because the British control it, right? The Japanese are all up in here, right? We have the French down here. So it's like we are having trouble entering into China because these spheres of influence are controlled by other countries. Part of what gets that control is the Opium Wars. But in 1900, we're going to have the Boxer Rebellion, when essentially, you're going to have a nationalist revolt in China against these foreigners. So when this happens, the U.S. is going to use its influence to put down the revolt and help the European powers. And at the end of it, we are going to get the open door notes, which essentially open up trade to China. No longer are we going to have these like closed spheres. With the open door notes, the United States can now trade with China. But just because we can trade with China doesn't mean we can actually get there. So we're going to need strategic bases along the way. One of them that's going to be really useful is going to be Hawaii. Hawaii actually had a lot of plantation owners. It also had a lot of missionaries. So there was a large American presence in Hawaii before. McKinley is going to put a tariff on sugar. And the Americans who are there are like, we don't want to have to pay this tax. So they're not going to have to pay a tariff if they're a part of the United States. And so Queen LILIUOKALANI is overthrown by a bunch of plantation owners and missionaries. She is locked up in a room. And then they basically asked to be annexed to the United States. A lot of people believe that the way that Hawaii is annexed as this like overthrow from Queen LILIUOKALANI is not legal, and that it was like fraudulent. Because, part of the idea of the United States is that states should only become a part of the United States if they want to become a part of the United States. And Queen LILIUOKALANI is like, well, the citizens actually didn't want to become a part of the United States, so it should be illegal anyway. We're going to take a look at the Spanish-American War, and the Spanish-American War actually starts with the Cuban Revolution against the Spanish in 1895. The yellow journalists in the United States are going to look at Cuba and its insurrection, and they're going to say, hey, this guy is terrible. We should go to war. Now, we have not cared a lot about Cuba before. We haven't cared a lot about other people before. Why are we kind of like, going into this now? Well, some people believe it's because these yellow journalists really wanted to go to war. They're kind of picking their fight, and they are like, we need to, save the Cubans. We need to kick the Spanish out of Cuba. And so they start printing these sensational pictures of all the suffering that is happening in Cuba. And they're kind of like beating the drum of war. Personally, Teddy Roosevelt is going to also play a role in this, and maybe also people of Teddy Roosevelt's ilk. McKinley is the president, and he was a Civil War vet. And McKinley was like, I don't know if we should go to war, right? He had been in war. He is like, war is not that great. Teddy Roosevelt was young when the war started. He never has gone to war, and he was born a sickly child in New York City. And so Teddy Roosevelt is going to kind of write this book about the strenuous life. And what he basically believes is that, like, through his pure force of will and, like, manliness, he overcame his sickness. And so he calls this the strenuous life. So he goes to, like, Harvard, he plays football, he boxes, he quits his job, or after Harvard, I think he tried to get married and his wife died. He goes out into the West and becomes a rancher, where he's like wandering around in the West, getting in fights and riding horses. When he's done there, he becomes a New York City police officer. In the midst of all this time is like a rough and tumble police commissioner. He actually works with Jacob Riis. And so he's done all of these crazy things, but he's never gone to war. He's killed 1 million animals, but he's never gone to war. And so Teddy really wanted to go to war. So he starts calling out McKinley. He's like, McKinley, you have no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. This guy is in the same political party as McKinley, and he's calling him out. And he's like, we need to go to war. On top of that, you have these like journalists who really want to go to war. And so McKinley is like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send a ship out to check things out, to see how things are going in Cuba, just to see how it's going. So he sends out the battleship Maine to Cuba to see how things are, and then the Maine blows up. Now, what's going to happen in the headlines of the yellow journalist is they are going to say Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo, right? And then they show these people like rah, like dying, and like bodies are flying everywhere, right? And it's like, right? Now, here is the thing. This does not, it's yellow journalism because it's like sensational headline. It's not like, incident at the Maine, if they called it maybe like an incident, then maybe that would be different. Because what's going to happen is months later, even after the war is done, they are going to do an investigation, right? And what they're going to find is that the explosion, right? If it came from, the explosion actually explodes out. So like the shrapnel is exploding out, right? If the shrapnel is exploding out, what they think happened is that there was a bunch of gunpowder in the bottom of this boat that exploded. So it was not a bomb or a torpedo. It was an accident, right? Which, if it says Maine explosion caused by bomb, torpedo, or accident, that would be different, right? But the yellow journalists don't pose that as an option. It's either the Spanish blew us up by a bomb or the Spanish blew us up by a torpedo and we go to war. What I love about this war is it rhymes, and it actually was used at the time. Remember the Maine to hell with Spain, right? The Maine blows up and we go to war with Spain. Easy to remember. So Teddy is going to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He is, as it sounds, this is not like, a really important job, but he is going to make it important. He essentially calls up Commodore Dewey and he's like, hey, y'all should attack the Philippines because the Philippines was another Spanish colony. So while we were going to war to free Cuba, Teddy tells the fleet to go to the Philippines. And the fleet is going to join up with some Filipino insurrectionists, and they are going to win. When the fleet is on its way, they basically telegraph the president, and they're like, hey, do you want us to do this? And the president didn't even know about it, and he was like, yeah, I guess so. So anyway, we are going to take over the Philippines because basically Teddy put it in the ear. After Teddy gets that going, he quits his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He goes to Brooks Brothers. He gets a uniform made for him and all of his buddies. He calls up his cop friends in New York City. He calls up his rancher friends from the West, and they all meet up in Florida, and they become what's called the Rough Riders. Not only does he call up all his buddies, he also calls up a publicist. He calls up photographers and videographers, and he is going to rush to Cuba to get his war experience. And so this is a famous picture of him after he took out San Juan Hill. There are his photographers. He becomes the hero of San Juan Hill. Meanwhile, who's not in the picture is all of the African American troops who had been fighting for months before Teddy showed up and get very little credit. So Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Rider becomes like the hero of the war. And people call this the splendid little war. It lasts 3 months. And in the end, we are going to get Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines is going to be the major question because we are going to free Cuba because of the Teller Amendment, but we are going to change that slightly after because we are going to say, but we're going to take a base. We're going to make Guantanamo Bay. But there's a big question about what to do with Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and the one I'm going to focus on is the Philippines. Because the Filipinos did not want to become a part of the United States. Aguinaldo fought with the Americans. He used the Declaration of Independence as inspiration as a fight against the Spanish imperial forces, and he thought when they were done that he would be independent. So when the United States, after the war is over, says you're going to become a part of the United States, he immediately starts fighting the U.S. For the freedom. So anti-imperialists are basically going to say we should not fight in these wars. We should not fight Filipinos to keep the Philippines when we are a democracy, and we just shouldn't do it. There are various reasons why people are going to be anti-imperialist. Some people are racist. Some people don't want to take over the Philippines because they don't like Filipinos. Some people are going to say it's going to cost us jobs if we bring this in. Some people are there are varying reasons why people do not want to take it over, and some people really just believe that this is anti-democratic. People like Mark Twain are going to write the war prayer, and he's just like, this goes against all of our moral principles. We should not be an imperialist nation. Imperialists are going to go back to what we were talking about before. Politically, this is best for the country. Under white man's burden, we need to do it because they can't do it themselves. We should do it to keep ourselves strong. Religious leaders like to keep it because they want to spread religion. And really, a lot of folks wanted to do it because we needed to have these markets and we needed ports and access. So, there are differing perspectives, imperialist and anti-imperialist. And a lot of it comes down to spreading our culture and having markets to sell all of our goods. And in the end, we are going to take over the Philippines and the imperialists are going to win. But this invasion is really terrible. I think we know a lot about the Vietnam War, but we do not know a lot about the Philippine insurrection or the Philippine War. Some people estimate up to 1 million Filipinos died in this war, especially due to disease. The same things that were happening to the Cubans and the reason why we went to the Spanish-American War happened to the Filipinos. We put these folks in concentration camps. We basically say if you're in the camp, you're good. If you're outside, you're bad. We are going to torture people. We are going to waterboard them. We have times where a general tells folks that you should kill everyone over 10. And part of it is because just like in Vietnam, the Filipinos are going to fight a guerrilla war. So in the middle of the night, the Americans would be attacked, and then in the morning, they would wake up and take out a whole village. This is a terrible war. It takes us 3 months to get the Philippines. It's going to take us 3 years to keep it and put down this insurrection. Now that we own this as an area, there's a question about should we let these places become a state? And this is where I feel like, racism definitely plays a hand, because when we take over Texas, when we take over California, when we take over these other places, we let them become a state. But when it comes to the Philippines, when it comes to Puerto Rico, we do not let them become a state. And I think a lot of it is because we don't want them in the Congress at that time. So what happens with the Philippines is we are going to fight a war for 3 years, and then we basically start a process of like pacification or a policy of attraction. And what we try to do is give incentives for Filipinos to like the United States. We build schools, we do roads, we do a lot of investment. And this is going to undermine a lot of the revolutionaries' appeal. We are then going to allow them to have their own elected assembly, and they are going to gain their independence after World War II. Puerto Rico is still, a territory. There's always a question of whether it's going to be a state. And, I put a video up the other day that you could take a look at. But, the Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States, but they cannot vote in elections. They do not have senators. Some people believe that they want to become a state. There might be something that says that later. But a lot of people used to not want to become a state because they had a lot of tax incentives, but those have kind of gone away. So they are basically not a state, and they are not their own country. They are their own thing, and that's what happened in those insular cases. Anyway, in the election of 1900, McKinley is going to try to figure out what to do with Teddy. Now, Teddy doesn't listen. Teddy is crazy. What are you going to do with somebody that you don't know what to do with but is wildly popular? Make them vice president. Vice president doesn't really do anything, and McKinley felt like he could benefit from his popularity. The problem is McKinley is going to get killed shortly after, and Teddy Roosevelt is going to become president. And when Teddy becomes president, Teddy does as Teddy wants to, and he takes his big navy and he wants to be the policeman of the world. So famously, Teddy said that you should speak softly and carry a big stick. And essentially, Teddy believes that the United States should flex its muscle in South America and Mexico and Central America and basically be the policeman and keep out European countries. Essentially, there needs to be muscle behind the Monroe Doctrine. And so he calls this preventative intervention in Latin America, and he wants to be the global policeman, and so that is what he does. He is a big follower of Alfred T. Mahan. He believes in the power of sea power upon history, and so one of the things he wants to do is build the Panama Canal. And so Teddy went to Colombia, and he's like, hey, Colombia, can we build a canal? And Colombia wanted too much. So then Teddy basically creates Panama. He assists the Panamanian Revolution. He gives them naval assistance. He gives them money. And then after Panama becomes an independent nation, Teddy asks Panama for the canal, and Panama says yes. So Teddy says, I took the canal. Let Congress debate. So this is like a pretty classic example of Teddy essentially creating a country to make a canal. This is what he did. There is also things happening in Asia. We are going to be settling things with the Russo-Japanese War. We are going to also have a gentleman's agreement for Japanese laborers. And that is essentially it. All right, guys, there is going to be an entrance ticket, and that's about it. Talk to you later.